The GOP debate is just hours away. Their fifth debate, Republicans' fifth debate, is happening tonight. There are a lot of new polls coming out every day, each telling a different story about how the candidates are resonating with voters.
In this national poll by Monmouth University, Donald Trump seems untouchable. He is far ahead of the pack at 41%, but another recent poll indicates Trump could have trouble securing a victory in Iowa. Among Iowa caucus goers, Senator Ted Cruz appears to be the most popular candidate with 31% of voter support. So how are voters supposed to keep it all straight? Well, we've got CBS News elections director Anthony Salvanto here to break it all down for us. Hey, Anthony.
How are you?
I'm good. So, listen, we've asked viewers to weigh in with questions about the polling process because a lot of people are very confused, and there are so many polls, and viewers want to know, why are all these polls so different? Yeah. So the first question, I guess, comes from viewer Jason Chen. He asked about how pollsters determine who is representative of the country. In other words, how can 1,000 people represent the entire country?
Okay, so keeping it all straight, how can 1,000 people in a country, in a poll represent the whole country? Part of that is we do sampling in our lives every day, and sometimes we don't even realize it. Do either of you cook? Do you cook sometimes?
I do.
Okay.
Don't look at me.
Yeah.
Don't look at me.
So one of the great pollster examples of this is you're cooking a soup. You don't drink it all to taste it to see if it's done or if it tastes good. You take a sample of it, right? But in that little sample, then you have to ask yourself, are all the ingredients in there? Now, not to stretch the analogy too far, but a pollster has to make sure that their sample looks like a little microcosm of the state or the country that you're trying to measure. So if we're talking about a national poll, you have to make sure that you've polled people from the north and the south and the east and the west. If you're talking about demographics, you have to make sure you get somebody from across all different age groups, because we know that different age groups vote differently, right? So you do that across a lot of demographic groups, and you make sure that everybody either has a chance to be included or you know who's in and who's out. And if you get that sample, and all people who are watching the polls should be looking at this. It takes a little bit of work, but looking at that and saying, does that look like the United States? Or, and this is where it gets really tricky, does that look like voters? And that's where pollsters start to run into a lot of trouble.
Let me ask you about that. One of the questions that came up is, do pollsters ever question people who aren't even registered to vote?
Yeah, sometimes they do. And this is where it becomes difficult. Anytime you see a poll now, you're buying into that pollster's assumptions and that pollster's modeling of who they think might be likely to turn out, who's a real voter. Now, we've just seen a bunch of polls you mentioned in Iowa. Some had Cruz up, some had Trump up. Okay. What happened, I think, is that there are some polls that go after everybody. They start by calling phone numbers. And Trump tends to do a little bit better with them. And if you start with, by comparison, a list of registered voters, then what happens is you might narrow down a little bit the people that you're talking to. Some polls even go so far as to only go out and talk to people with long vote histories. They figure, very reasonably, well, if they've shown up before, they'll probably show up again. Perfectly reasonable, but it's a different approach. So in those polls, Trump doesn't do quite as well. And what I think that tells you politically is that his support extends to, yes, reliable voters, but also to a lot of voters who've never shown up before. And so part of the challenge of his campaign, you can read this by differences in the polls, is that he's got to convert enthusiasm to action for a lot of people who haven't turned out in the past. And that's what some of these differences in the polls, I think, are picking up.
So can we really predict a likely winner, for example, in Iowa, where we're seeing Ted Cruz polling much higher than Donald Trump? Do you think that that poll is reliable enough to say Ted Cruz has got it?
There's a difference between looking at what's happening now and predicting what's happening in 2 months. There's a great pollster, Andy Cohen, who passed recently, who had a great line. He used to say there's a difference between handicapping, which is what the folks out in Vegas do, or et cetera, and fortune telling, and measuring what's happening now. And I think the best of polling right now is trying to read the mood of the country, trying to read the mood of the state, and let's put aside for a while who's going to win. And I can tell you that because we know Iowans always tell us that most of them make up their minds in the last couple of weeks before the caucuses. Go ahead.
Well, so let me ask you this, because something that some candidates have said, especially candidates who don't have high poll numbers, is that it's early yet. You know, this isn't something that necessarily we should take so seriously, because of course, if you're down, you know, you want to discount them. But a viewer had a question. Viewer C. Hin Kwok asked, why do some folks say all the polls are wrong?
Well, that's a very good question, and we get that all the time. And people say, well, I don't know anybody who is also voting for so-and-so. I don't know anybody who's voting for Cruz. They must be wrong. Why do they all look wrong? First of all, we've never had so much polling as we have now. And that's because, this is the good news, there's so many different ways to reach people. You can reach people on landlines. You can reach people on cell phones. You can reach people online. We put together big online panels that are representative. Okay. But when you see so many polls, sometimes, as you said, it can be confusing, and surely some of them, just statistically, some of them are going to be off by a few points. One of the things that start to happen, too, is that we can't demand the kind of precision from these estimates that I think some people expect. We put a margin of error on these things for a reason. These are estimates that fall within a range, and if we did it again, they'd fall somewhere within that range. But you can't get down to the decimal point. And so things are going to change. You also have to remember the human side of all this. These are people we're talking to, and they have a right to change their minds. And it's a democracy. And there's a campaign out there who's trying to target these same people and change their minds. Let them change their minds. Have the discussion. It's okay.
You know, you just said something that's interesting, because Dorothy Montgomery had that question, do you call landlines when you do this? And you did say that they do. I would assume that probably there are a lot of landlines still used, because we tend to think that everybody has a cell phone, but there are some people, my grandmother doesn't use a cell phone.
Yeah, there are, but frankly, it's on the decline.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you go back about 10 years in the industry, a lot of folks were worried about what would happen as everybody switched over to cell phones. Well, now most of the good polls complete at least half of their calls on cell phones. So we try to reach people, yes, on landlines, yes, on their cell phones, and of course people use the internet now. They can put together online panels. So we have these different ways to reach people, but gone are the days, for the most part, when you could do a perfect probability sample, just start dialing phone numbers and get a perfect microcosm of America, like we said. There is more work involved now in making sure that that sample is representative, and some of it depends on how you reach folks.
All right, Anthony Salvanto, thank you very much. Also, thanks to our viewers Jason Chen, Seen Hin Kwok, and Dorothy Montgomery. Appreciate it.